Hey guys, Bert Kammerer here with SAB Heli Division, and today I'm going to be talking about some miscellaneous sort of tips and tricks that pertain to building, maintaining, and repairing your Goblin 500 helicopter. Some of you might have already watched the build video that I made, where I took basically a Goblin 500 out of the box and built it from the very beginning to the very end. If you watched that video, you pretty much already know every single tip and trick that there is to know about the Goblin 500. But if you guys are not in the mood to watch a 3-hour long video and you already have built your 500, I have some basic tips and tricks that will kind of help you a little bit, give you some ideas about your specific Goblin helicopter. So I'm going to be quoting some clips from the built video on this one. Basically, let's start with tip number 1. This one has to do with the battery tray that goes down here in the helicopter. This tray supports your ESC, it supports your tail servo, your battery, main fly battery. It can even support your BEC if you have one, receiver. I mean, it's a multi-purpose tray. And tip number 1 has to do with drilling holes on this tray. Let's take a look. You want to drill 4 holes. You want to drill a hole right here, right here, right here, and right here. And why do you want to do that? Because that's going to hold your ESC. That's the easiest way to hold your ESC. Your ESC will go here, and you'll run zip ties through the hole and tighten them, and it'll secure the ESC. Because of the way the plastic was made, you really don't have a lot of room to put like Velcro or like tape, so it's better just to use the zip ties. So instead of using a drill, I'm going to use a Dremel. I have it right here, it's ready to go. So I'm going to go ahead and drill my four holes right here real quick. You want to use a bit that is spinning pretty fast and just do it as quickly as you can so you don't really burn a lot of plastic in the process. So, alright, so as you can see now, if I were to put this together, now we have 4 little holes right here. 1, 2, 3, 4, so you'll run the zip ties and hold your ESC. Okay, let's move on to tip number 2. Tip number 2, we're going to talk a little bit about play on the secondary shaft. Secondary shaft, it's the shaft that holds your main pinion, your main pulley, and your tail pulley that goes in the front. Let's take a look at this clip from the built video. That's our one-way pulley assembly right here. It's already got the one-way bearing inside as well as 2 radial bearings at the end. And if you look at the manual here, the small side diameter, the small diameter is supposed to face up. If you look at the pulley, this one's got a small diameter right here, this one's got a big diameter. So this pulley needs to go like this. And the next thing is to install the tail pulley. And this will go literally like this. Now, if you have a little bit of slop up and down on this pulley, you can remove it by using this extra shim that they have in that bag. I'm going to go ahead and put the screw here. So we need to reach into the bags that didn't open quite yet. The bag 2.2 and 2.3, according to page 9, I hadn't opened those. 2.3 and 2.2. So this long screw right here doesn't have a shank. Again, don't worry about it. That's the screw that holds your one-way pulley to the secondary, correction, not the one-way, the tail pulley to the secondary shaft. So we're going to find the hole here. On one side of the pulley is threaded and one side is not. So you don't need a knot on the other side. There's a thread in the pulley itself here. We'll tighten that a little bit here, and yep, there's a lot of slop. So we're going to go ahead and put that shim in there real quick. Quite simple. Just throw the shim in between the one way and the tail pulley. And now there's still some slop, which you want a little bit, but not a whole lot, so that's perfect. All right, tip number 3. Tip number 3 has to do with greasing your O-rings or your dampeners. You're supposed to use some grease on your main O-rings right here on the head and on your O-rings that are on the tail. If you have not done so, if you built your Goblin 500 and you did not grease these, please take this apart and use some grease. It'll extend the life of your dampeners. Let's take a look at the clip from the build video. Look at our head block right here and look at what the manual says. The manual says to use a little bit of Vaseline grease. Well, it says Vaseline because you don't want to use a petroleum-based grease. There is some grease in here already. I see it. They put it at the factory. And there's actually quite a bit of it. So I'm just going to go ahead and wipe that grease a little bit with my finger and then just rub it on this. I mean, it feels very greasy to me, so I don't see the need to put more. But if you do need to put more grease, just go ahead and use some just standard grease. As you can see, there's quite a bit of grease in there. So it's always a good idea to grease your O-rings. So they're greased pretty well. Okay, so here's the 2 little O-rings. I'm going to go ahead and use some synthetic grease I have here for you guys that have other brand helicopters. You probably have one of these, and this is synthetic. This is not petroleum based, so I'm just going to use a deliberate amount on this O-ring and stick it in here and do the same thing with the other one. There's lots of grease everywhere. This is messed up. Okay, and I'm going to wipe out the excess with the tiny little 1.5 and a rag. I want to get rid of the grease that's in the center of the O-ring, because when I insert the tail output shaft, I don't want the threads on the tail output shaft to get full of grease. That would be very bad, because then the Loctite will not hold and your tail blade grips will come off in flight. Moving on to tip number 4. Tip number 4, don't forget to assemble your tail pulleys. I know this sounds kind of dumb, but when you're assembling, when you're putting your helicopter together, the 2 tail pulleys, the one in the front and the one in the back, they're not, even though they look like they're assembled from the factory, they're not tightened and they're not Loctited. You need to tighten them and Loctite them as I show in the video. Let's take a look. With the tail pulley, be careful because it's disassembled. Not quite, but the bolts are not tightened all the way. So what you do is you remove these bolts, there's 3 of them, and then you put Loctite and then you put them back together. So I'm going to do that real quick while I speed up the video. Okay, so this is tight. And last but not least, we're going to go back to our tail pulley. And remember what we did with the tail pulley that was for the front part of the helicopter. We're going to do the same thing with this pulley because this pulley is not tightened. You have to be very careful and keep that in mind. You have to put Loctite on these little screws, these little bolts, and you need to tighten it up. And tip number 5, servo installation. Please make sure you install your servos onto the servo mounts before you install everything on the helicopter. If you mount the servo mounts on the helicopter, you will not be able to mount the servos. I talk extensively about servos and how I do the servo mounting during the build video. Let's take a look. You have 2 different types of servo mounts, I guess you could call them, carbon fiber servo mounts. You need to decide which one you need to use for the type of servo that you have. Get these servo mounts out of the bags and then just see if they fit on your servo. As you can see, the small ones fit very nicely on the JR servo. There's several different ways to mount the servo here. You can mount the servo on the back side, on the front side of this blade, or on the back side of this blade. You have to decide which mounting position you're going to need. So the first thing I'm going to do is, without any Loctite or anything, I'm going to mount one servo mount to the helicopter real quick. And I'm going to explain to you why I'm doing this. I'm going to pick a spot here. I'm going to do this side. It just makes it easier when you do it this way. I'm only going to use one bolt, that's it. I'm just going to use this for measurement purposes. So the goal here when you install the servos is, once again, since all these servos are different sizes, all the mini servos are different sizes, the goal here is that the distance from the carbon fiber servo mount right here to the center line of the ball should be approximately, or as close to, 18.5 millimeters. So what you're going to do is you take your servo, you remove the bolt from the servo. So I'm going to put my servo horn here, and I'm going to kind of just eyeball it, just make a guess. I'm going to put the servo right here on the back side of the servo mount, like this. And I'm going to measure from the servo mount to an imaginary center line on the ball to see if I get 18.5. And I don't know if it's easy to see on the video, but that's a lot less than 18.5. So I think the best way for me to mount the servo would be like this, with the servo on the inside of the servo mount. There's many different ways to install servos, again, depending on the servo you have. Take a look at page 17, it explains it really well. If you mount the servo on the inside of the carbon servo mount and your ball is still not 18.5 but less than 18.5, then you would mount the ball, one of these balls, you would mount it with the spacer that comes with it, and you will use the longer small bolts to secure the ball to your servo horn. If you mount the servo, for example, on that side like I have it, and you're right at the closer to 18.5, then you don't need to use the spacer. You just put the ball directly onto the servo horn with the small tiny little bolt, and so forth. If your servo is too deep or too long from the mounting tabs to the spline, then you might need to mount it on the back side of the servo mounting, carbo servo mounting tab. So every application is different. For JR 3717, the way I have it laid out is the servo will go in the front of, right in the front of the carbo servo mount, and I'm going to mount the ball without the spacer. And that'll give me as close to 18.5 as possible. Again, the goal is to have the right angle here between the servo ball and the swash plate. So now I'm going to remove the servo mount from the helicopter, and I'm going to go ahead and proceed to mount the servos to the servo mounts first. So ideally at this point you want to power up your flybarless system or your receiver or whatever it is you're going to use, and you want to center all your servos. And what you want to do is you want to lay out your servos as if they were mounted on the helicopter. So this would be the servo on the right side of the swash plate, and it would go just like this. This would be the servo that would be on the left side, just like this. And then this would be the servo that would go on the back side, on the elevator side. And then what I would do at this point, actually it would go like this. All the servo splines go towards the inside of the helicopter. So at this point I would power this up and I would center my servos, and then once the servos are centered, I would install the balls onto the servo horns, and then the servo horns onto the servos, lock them up, and then proceed to mount the servos onto the servo mounts. Now I got my servo horns on the servos. Some people ask me what servo horns I run. These are made by Mikado. These are designed for the logos. I like them a lot because they're plastic, so they break in a hard crash, but they're strong enough to not break in flight. Obviously you can use a metal horn. Another thing that's important is to keep in mind, and I didn't mention that, the distance between the center line of the ball and the spline. On this particular servo right here, my distance is approximately, I would say, about 18 millimeters or so. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to mount the servos onto the servo mounts. And one thing to keep in mind is, like I said before, the spline of the servo goes towards the main shaft, and the angle side on the chamfer outside the carbon mount goes to the outside. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And the way I do it is, again, the servo on this application will go on the main shaft side of the servo, the carbon fiber servo mount, and then these pieces right here go on the horn side of the servo, or the spline side of the servo, and then I'm going to tighten them with the bolts, which will go on the back side of this plate. So I'm going to do this for all 3 servos, and then we'll mount the servos onto the helicopter. Okay, we're done with the mounting the servos onto the servo mounts. Now I'm going to mount the whole assembly servo mount onto the helicopter itself. Tip number 6, motor belt tension and alignment. The alignment, more than anything, is what's critical. The tension, you can pretty much use the tension that you get preset from the springs that are in the motor mount. That's a good tension. But let's take a look at the built video where I talk about motor belt alignment. You want to make sure that your motor belt is riding in the right position, not too high, not too low. So what you do is spin the motor a few times in the direction of where the motor will be spinning. Make sure the head is rotating clockwise when seen from above. And just do that a few times and look at your belt. Look at the motor belt, how it's riding on the main pulley. If the belt is too low, just move your motor pulley up and do this again. If it's too high, move your motor pulley down and do this again, and find that sweet spot. And when you got that sweet spot, just go back here and make sure that you tighten your motor pulley all the way. So mine is riding perfectly, so I'm going to go ahead and crank on this set screw a little bit, make sure it's tightened all the way, and we're good to go. Tip number 7, building your tail push rod. I have my own way to build a tail push rod. I think it's a very redundant, very safe way to build your tail push rod. Let's take a look. Now, according to the manual, you have dimensions to make this rod. And the dimensions in the manual are actually very accurate. I generally recommend people to first finish the helicopter, have everything all done, have the tail inserted, the tail boom inserted under the frames, and have everything completely ready to go before you do this. Why? Because every tail servo has slightly different dimensions. The spline might be a little bit farther away from the end of the servo or closer to it, and you might never get the exact, most accurate measurement of your tail push rod until you have everything set up. So I would do this for last. But I'm not going to do it right now, but I'm going to give you a trick on how I do this. I would tighten this ball link and turn it enough so that it's not tightened all the way. You want to have some room to loosen it up and some room to tighten it up as well. Then what I would do is I don't personally like to use CA for this. CA gets brittle, and it depends on the part of the world where you live in. You know, in some places it gets so hot that the CA will get so brittle, so cold, sorry, and the CA will get so brittle that it'll eventually fail. I like to use epoxy or JB Weld. So I have epoxy here, and I'm not going to use this for the time being. But basically what I would do is I would pour some deliberate amount of epoxy right here, and I would insert this into here, and I would just let the epoxy set. And once the epoxy is set and this is tight, the next thing I would do is I would actually take a small piece of sanding paper, and I would sand probably the last inch of the rod. And then what I do is I take a little bit of CA, and I put a little bit of CA between the carbon rod here and the metal rod, and then I take sawing thread, just like this, and then I wrap the sawing thread around this many times. So I'll start like turning like this and wrap it around it just like that. Just put a lot of sawing thread and make sure the sawing thread goes to the rod, to the metal rod, and to the carbon rod. And once that's set in there and it's all nice and neat, all wrapped around it, then what you do is you take CA again and you whip the CA on the sawing thread. And that'll get really, really strong. Remember, you do not want to play with this. This is critical. If one of these things break loose in flight, you're going to crash. Other people use a brass or a copper or something sleeve, and after they've basically epoxy the rod into the carbon rod, they'll slide a sleeve onto it and put a little bit of glue before they do. That works as well. I just like the sawing thread because it's simple. You can find sawing thread everywhere. It doesn't matter if it's not the perfect diameter or whatever. And then once I'm done with that, so it doesn't look so bad because it'll look kind of ugly, then you just get some just standard like heat shrink, and just take a little piece of heat shrink and cut it to the right dimension, you know what I mean, and then just put it in there and heat shrink it, and it'll look nice and neat. Nobody will know that you have an ugly bunch of sewing thread under your tail push rod. Tip number 8, tail push rod guide. The tail push rod guide is a tiny little bit of piece of plastic that goes inside the boom right through this hole right here. There's a couple of things to keep in mind that will make your life easier when you install it. Let's take a look. This piece of plastic is a guide for your tail push rod, and it goes inside the boom. Basically goes in this hole right here. But before we stick it in there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that bolt and I'm going to put it inside here and I'm going to tighten it. Why am I going to do this? I'm going to tighten it all the way because that'll open up the plastic a little bit. Sometimes if you try to put this inside the boom before you do this first, you're going to have a hard time trying to tighten this. It's not going to want to go through the right, it's not going to want to reach, go through that hole. So go ahead and do that and then pull it out, and then I'm gonna go ahead and open this the opening where the tail push rod goes in. I'm just gonna open it a little bit with the pliers because it's usually pretty tight. Now you want to be careful here, very, very lightly, because you don't want to break this piece. If you break this piece, you might not be able to find one right away. Just like that, just very careful. Then I'm going to insert this onto the boom. Just like that, and hopefully this bolt will go right to where it needs to go because I already enlarged the plastic a little bit. You don't need to use CA or anything. This will stay there. There's nothing to be CAing or Loctiting or anything. Perfect. That's it. Tip number 9. This is actually quite a dumb tip. You guys might already know this, but this makes inserting the tail belt through the boom a lot easier. Let's see. So next step is just to insert the whole tail case onto the boom. And generally what I do, the easiest way to do this is I take a piece of tape, and I don't have any other kind of tape handy other than this double-sided tape, which will work, and I'll just cut a little piece off of it, and then I'll just wrap that piece around the tip of the tail belt, just like this. And it just makes it really easy to fish that tail belt through the boom. So you just like literally go like this, and it should go all the way through. I need to let gravity help me here. And there it is, tail belt is on the other side. It's really easy to do it that way. Tip number 10. Alright, you built your tail push rod. You put your tail push rod inside the boom. And now you're trying to insert the bowl link at the end of the tail push rod onto the bowl that's in the belt crank in the tail. And you're really having a hard time because the tail push rod is inside the boom and you can't find your angle and you're just having a hard time. Well, all you need is just a simple set of needle nose pliers. Let's see. Take some needle nose pliers, very easy to do. Take some needle nose pliers and just take this, the bowl link, and put it up against the bowl, just like so. And then, as you can see, this plastic piece has a hollow area here, or a little hole in here. Just put one end of the needle nose pliers there, the other end of the pliers on the bowl link, and then push. There. So it's not that hard. Now it's inside. Tip number 11. insert your tail boom all the way into the frames until it stops. This is very important. You want to reach that stopping point. Let's see. And the boom slot in the boom will go in between the aluminum piece that's right there that I showed you and the bolts. And then you're going to push forward all the way until it stops. Okay, the boom is all the way in. Tip number 12, aligning your tail case. This is also very important. If you don't align it correctly, you're going to have premature tail belt wear. So let's take a look. Before I go ahead and tighten the tail belt all the way, we want to make sure that the tail case all the way, we want to make sure that the tail is square. In other words, as you look at this, you can actually manipulate this a little bit. Even though we have some standoffs and some spacers right here, if you pull to one side or the other side, the tail might end up being a little off. You want to make sure that you have a perfect 90-degree angle from the tail belt to the tail output shaft. So make sure that's the case. You don't want the tail case to be crooked. Let's move on to tip number 13. Has to do with the inserting and removing, but more than anything, removing your battery tray. This is quite important. You do not want to break your helicopter. Let's take a look. Another thing that's important to keep in mind here is be careful when you use the release mechanism here. This is pretty strong, but it's not meant to be pulled really hard on. When you insert your battery, you just literally put the tray and it'll fall in place. Actually, that's a very nice snug fit. When you're going to remove the battery, you got to pull on this and just pull on the tray. But again, when you pull on this, be careful, because this is part of your frame. If you pull too hard on this, you're going to break the frame. I've never broken a frame before, but one of the guys at the factory, just the other day, we were together and he pulled on this so hard that he actually cracked the frame. Tip number 14, your serial number, the importance of registering your Goblin helicopter. Let's see why this is so important. Now, I want to talk about this very briefly. Bag 9 has your serial number tag. It's right here. This is a very important bag. Basically, your serial number is unique. It belongs to you. This means that you bought your own Goblin and you bought it from us and from a legitimate source. And basically, with this serial number, you can get support from us. Even though we encourage our distributors and our dealers to support you, the end user, we actually will keep track of your Goblin and we will let you know if there's anything that you need to be aware of. For example, if there's a recall on a part, if we determine that there's an issue, anything, we will let you know about it. So we cannot be held responsible if you do not register your Goblin, because we would not be able to communicate with you when it comes to important stuff. In the past with the 700, we addressed some issues immediately and we were relying on our distributors to let the customers know. This time around, and with any other kit, even with the 700, if you have a 700, go ahead and register online. So with this, you go to goblin-helicopter.com and you register your Goblin online and enter your serial number. And if you have another model, it's not a 500, but say a 700 or a 770 or a 630, you still can register without a serial number. So anyway, take this serial number and mount it here on your helicopter. And that'll just show everybody that you bought this, again, from a legitimate source, you have a warranty on it, or that you have support from us on this model. And last but not least, tip number 15. This has to do with your main gear and your main shaft removal. So say that you guys have been flying your Goblin for quite a while and now you had a crash, you bent your main shaft or you broke your main gear and you have to remove your main shaft. Well, if you remove the main shaft, you basically have to loosen up the bolt that holds the main shaft to the main gear, pull the bolt out, pull the bowlings from the 3 servos or from the swash plate and pull your main shaft up. As soon as you do that and you pull on your gear, the gear will come out and all your spacers, your spacer and your shims are going to fall off. Well, how do you put it back together? It's actually quite simple. Very few people think about this. All you have to do is put your helicopter upside down. Now you can go ahead and put the 2 shims in there, or 3 shims, or 1 shim, however number of shims you had, in through there. Then you can put the spacer, and then you put the main gear in. You take a long screwdriver and you stick it through the upper bearing and you center everything. You align the spacer and the shims with the bearing, and then you simply insert the main shaft upside down. The easiest thing to do. I saw a guy the other day trying to do it like this way, and he was really having a hard time keeping the shims and the spacer lined up in the hole. So that was tip number 15. So I hope you enjoyed these 15 tips that pertain to the Goblin 500 helicopter. See you guys next time.